He suffered and died for us. Amen. He suffered and died for us. This is one of those moments that I do not feel comfortable. The symbolism Joel talked about as it relates to the cross behind me, that's an old wooden cross with a black sash on it symbolizing the death of Jesus, brings in a very somber perspective. I struggled with how I would introduce today's message because many of you are very aware on the Christian calendar, this is considered Palm Sunday. It still is Palm Sunday, but there's so much to cover, I couldn't possibly cover it, despite how much you desire to stay in the church house from today through next week. If you really want to consider John's perspective of Palm Sunday, I want to encourage you to take a look at John chapter 12. For those of you who are incredibly astute, you realize we're not in John chapter 12. We're in John chapter 18. For that matter, those of you who like to read the Bible, I don't know any better book to begin with than the book of John. The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings, and much like Genesis, there is much mirrored in the book of John as to how things began. But as I shared with you already, I'm not comfortable, and I wasn't sure how to introduce this. Part of it was I thought I might talk about the robe that I have on that I don't particularly like. You may not know that, but I just told you, so you know it now. I don't particularly like this robe. I don't know what it is about the color. It has nothing to do with how it feels. I just don't really like it. But I'm not going to talk about that because as much as I was struggling with how I was going to introduce this, I had an experience this morning after my wife left the parsonage. I simply plugged in the iron. And within 30 seconds of having plugged in the iron, an annoying, piercing sound began reverberating through the entire parsonage. They're called fire detectors. I don't know why the fire detectors were going off, but they're loud and they're piercing. But I still need to iron the shirt that I had on the ironing board, and the iron wasn't even entirely heated up. I know you never have issues in life, never have struggles in life, never have challenges in life. I am the only one, but this is the struggle that I had this morning. I need to iron the shirt, and it's deafening. Deacon is in the laundry room, and I know he doesn't like the sound any more than I like the sound. I let him out, but I still needed to iron the shirt. The nature of a fire detector is that it's supposed to help save your life if you're sleeping when the fire begins. And in a well-orchestrated fire system, thank you, First Baptist Chilton, like the one in the parsonage, when one fire detector goes off, all of the fire detectors go off. So we're not talking about one beep, and it wasn't a beep, beep, beep. It started and it just kept going. We're talking about over 20 minutes of piercing, high-pitched, worse than nails on a chalkboard sound. I was so glad to get out of the parsonage and come over here. I don't know how to act. I did get the shirt ironed, but it made me think about why Jesus came. Sin was a problem that needed to be addressed. So God came in flesh to deal with our sin problem. We have a sin problem, and it's so annoying, it's so bothersome, it's so problematic, and yet there's nothing we can do about it. So as we introduce the book of John, Eugene Peterson addresses in his introduction saying that everything was broken and fallen, sinful and diseased, and was called into salvation by God's spoken word. That's Jesus. I hope we're clear. Jesus does not impose salvation as a solution. He doesn't make anybody get saved. I've been spending a lot of time in hospitals, and I encountered a person who had received an absolutely horrific prognosis and did not know whether she would live or die. With tears in her eyes, she talked through some of her theodicy and problems regarding not only what God could do, but how he could care for people and how he could allow good, moral people who have not chosen Jesus where they would go. So she asked me, but she didn't ask me as pastor. When I serve as chaplain, there's a lot of things that I do not do. And one thing I did to respond was to say that not once has God ever checked with me to determine whether someone was going to heaven or hell. Not once. He hasn't checked with me yet. I'm not expecting that call. But he has given an invitation to absolutely everybody. And absolutely everybody has the privilege to be able to choose Jesus. And he's so polite that he does not impose salvation on us, that even though he allowed his son, God in the flesh, Emmanuel, to come down and be with us, he doesn't make us choose him. And if we choose not to be with him, he will honor it. Todd Steele, in talking about the introduction of John, says that Jesus is entirely unique. And it's almost impossible to recognize face-to-face truth because sin is in the way. And yet Jesus' crucifixion is not a senseless tragedy. It is the display of a divine love for a world that cannot recognize God. Sin has gotten in the way, and the world can't recognize God. So let's look at what John really is talking about, and I'll get to 18 in a moment. But I want to tell us why this was written. John chapter 20, verse 31 declares, "But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." That's why the song I just finished playing before I stood to preach is entitled Jesus. This cross, that if it was an accurate depiction of what will happen this week, would be a crucifix, is all about Jesus. I wish I had time to walk through and talk through the powerfulness of the book of John. There's so much in the book of John that's so filled with power, but let me just peruse a few places and say a few things here and there. In chapter 18, in the first verse, it says, when he had finished praying, I hope you pray. verse 2, it says, Judas, who had betrayed him. I wish Judas was the last one that betrayed him. I wish we didn't betray him every time we don't choose him. I wish we didn't betray him and weren't known as betrayers of him simply because we do what we want to do rather than what he wants us to do. Verse 4, Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him. For those of you who want points from this message, first thing is he suffered. And the idea of suffering doesn't necessarily come when the initial physical pain biomedically is inserted. Can you imagine a death sentence being imposed and you know it's coming? Many have called Huntsville the Green Mile. The idea that you know death is coming, but you don't know when, and you don't know exactly how, and yet Jesus knew, and yet he still chose to go all the way to the cross. That's suffering. That's mental anguish. That is despair on a whole nother level. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him. He knew how much it would hurt. That's suffering. He knew how much the pain would be imposed upon him. That's suffering. Judas, that traitor, did the part that he did. Verse 10 of chapter 18, then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. A lot of times we just don't want bad stuff to happen. We think it's bad. We just do everything we can to make it not happen. That's what happened right here, and yet Jesus allowed it to happen. He said in the next verse, verse 11, in the B part, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? Often we want so much joy, so much happiness, so much smiling, so much pleasantry, so much gladness, so much yay, and no nay, and no hurt, and no pain, and no despair. But Jesus said, this is for me to do. Not because he'd done any wrong. Verse 22, one of the officials slapped him in the face. Can you imagine slapping God? He who had done nothing but heal people, feed people, care for people, love people, slapped in the face as if the person he was speaking to was of a higher estate than Jesus himself, slapped in the face. Verse 26, one of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you in the garden? Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. I don't know if we're denying Jesus. If we choose not to align ourselves entirely with God, entirely with his church, entirely with his teaching, are we denying Jesus? Then, before Pilate, to avoid the ceremonial uncleanness, here it is, the high priests and the leaders, the Jewish leaders, they didn't want to be ceremoniously unclean. So they were polite, good church people doing what appeared nice, doing what appeared good, so they wouldn't be ceremoniously unclean, and yet they were insisting that Jesus be crucified. Verse 30, if he were not a criminal,
they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you. But we have no right to execute anyone." But they were insistent that Jesus would be executed. Verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world." Just before verse 38 and 37b, "Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." We can hear his voice. The question is, will we heed his voice? Chapter 19. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. God took physical stripes for our sins. He suffered. Flesh was torn from his body. For our sins, he suffered. Not only the anguish of knowing what was coming, but the physical pain that he did not deserve. Verse 3b, once again they slapped him in the face. And when the opportunity to release him was presented, in verse 6b, what did they cry? "Crucify, crucify." Verse 12, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." Skip down to 15b. "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar." The chief priests answered. Everyone who calls themselves a leader within God's church is not necessarily doing his work or his will. And yet he can use anyone to accomplish what his will is. The Jewish leaders insisted they not release him. He suffered. The second point, not only did he suffer, but he died. Down in verses 31b, because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked for Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. Jesus did not faint death, he died. And then the Jewish leaders are trying to uphold the Jewish law when they had the law walking along with them. Now all of a sudden they want to act all spiritual. And they had his body taken down. Verse 33, but when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. He suffered and died, but it was all for us, for the sins that we've committed, for the wrongs that we have done.
for the things that we should have done and have not done, for our imperfections. I don't know that I've ever preached and left him in the grave in my presentation. But Good Friday can't become Good Friday until Resurrection Sunday morning, which is next week. And we certainly hope and pray that you'll come next week for the good news. But in the meantime, I hope we can take this week, often termed Holy Week, and consider Maundy Thursday, consider his death, consider his burial, consider, is it us slapping him by not seeking to do his will? Are we acting like the high priests and being all spiritual and yet not recognizing why he truly came, which was to save? So we're going to ask that today there be no benediction. Today there be no joyful departure, but just introspection and consideration of a God who loved us so much that he was willing to come in the flesh. And though he could come down, he would not come down and chose to die.